Hello everybody, you're welcome back again to the Reggae Appreciation Society. When we celebrate the beauty and the glory of reggae music in all its splendor, we often focus on the artists and hardly ever applaud the wonderful producers who oversee the production process, from the recording booth to the finished products on store shelves. The 1960s belonged to the pair of the great Coxsone Dodd and his rival in Duke Reid. But as far as the 1970s were concerned, it's hard to identify a more successful hitmaker than the phenomenal Joe Gibbs. A very bold statement to make, considering the fact that the 1970s were the peak years of that genre by far. But when you consider that despite being the producer that launched Dennis Brown into global superstardom, or the one that scored more than 100 number one hits in Jamaica's charts, or even the most advanced, sophisticated studio in the Caribbean, he was probably the producer most responsible for ending the reign of Coxsone Dodd's Studio One, which became official when he poached Dodd's right-hand man in D. Scratch Perry, a visionary and genius businessman with an unrivaled global outlook that saw him build relationships with international record labels and radio DJs, who truly took his artists to a global audience a few years before Vincent and Pat Chin got in on the action with VP Records. And let's not even talk about Joe Gibbs' legendary partnership with studio production genius Errol Thompson, a duo fondly referred to as the Mighty Two for their unbelievable influence on reggae, as they would help the genre reach its creative zenith in the 70s. But at the very peak of his enormous success, his music machine and empire was brought to its knees by a massive legal blow from an angry artist and giant international label, a precedent that shook Jamaica's recording industry for years to come. Let's take a look at the rise, reign and fall of the legendary Joe Gibbs. Now this story begins of course with Joe Gibbs, born Joel Arthur Gibson on October the 14th, 1942 in a small town called Salt Spring in St. James Parish of Jamaica, not very far from Montego Bay. After leaving high school, he moved to Cuba where he studied electronics before getting a job as an electronics technician at the US Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay for a few years, before he returned to Jamaica to work with the company at Montego Bay, and then onwards to Kingston, where he would set up his own TV and radio repair shop in 1965. Heavily inspired by the booming music wave in Jamaica in those times, he began to sell records out of his store. And when he combined that with his foundation as an electronics technician, he got drawn to the production side of the music business and would go to learn from popular producer Ken Lack. After gathering some months of experience, he would set up a tiny 2-track studio in the back of his shop in late 1966 and launched his first record label, Amalgamated Records. Around that time, singer Roy Shirley was introduced to Gibbs. He had been looking for a producer to record a song of his that was much slower than the prevailing ska rhythm. The pair would click, and Gibbs produced that song called Hold Them at the prestigious Federal Record Studios. And that song is regarded as one of the first rocksteady tunes ever recorded, and became a monster hit in Jamaica that reached number one on the charts and stayed up there for several weeks. The song's success would launch Joe Gibbs to overnight popularity as one of Jamaica's new hot producers. In that same period, D. Scratch Perry, who had various roles at Studio One as recording artist, A&R and producer, fell out with Coxsone Dodd over money and joined forces with Joe Gibbs in 1967. Gibbs and Perry would show their intent towards Studio One's dominance in a series of diss tracks aimed at Coxsone Dodd, like Run for Cover and Come Get Me. Unlike the instrumentally heavy era of ska, Gibbs preferred to make music for powerful vocalists with softer rhythms, and that would draw hordes of new singers to his studio, like ants to sugar. Unfortunately, he and Scratch Perry would fall out in just a year, but he would replace him in a masterstroke with a young firebrand producer called Winston Holness, aka 90 The Observer, who ironically had been a protege of Perry and hailed from Gibbs' hometown near Montego Bay. 90's superb talents would take Joe Gibbs Studios to the next level with a string of smash hits like Errol Dunkley's Please Stop Lying, the Pioneers' debut album Greetings from the Pioneers, and Love of the Common People by Nicky Thomas, which became a hit in Jamaica and crossed over to the UK, where it sold almost 200,000 copies and reached number 9 in the UK charts in 1970. In what were the early days of reggae, his studio backing band, Joe Gibbs and the Professionals, was a crack elite team that included Lynn Tate, Robbie Shakespeare, Errol Smith, and Leroy Horsemouth Wallace. Joe Gibbs Studio would score massive hits for many artists that included the Heptones and the Roy Wilson, and he made enough money to move to a new and bigger studio at Duhaney Park in 1972 and joined forces with Errol Thompson, a super and genius sound engineer who had first cut his teeth at Vincent Chin's Studio 17. Thompson's arrival would mark the dawn of something even bigger. That was also the year that a 15-year-old vocal genius named Dennis Brown, who had previously recorded for Coxsone Dodd, would enter into a spectacular collaboration with Joe Gibbs that opened a partnership with the production of his classic tune Money in My Pocket. The mighty two would craft a sound that became the sonic signature of Joe Gibbs Studios. A sublime sharp sound with heavy bass lines and slick percussion. They would capture and embody the essence of 1970s roots reggae, and in my opinion, back the third of that decade's greatest hits. From big youth bangers like Foreman vs. Ali, Jacob Miller's Tired Philic Weed, Dreadlocks Time by Gino Biles, Under Heavy Manners for Prince Far Eye, Uptown Top Ranking for Althea and Donna, Three-Piece Suit for Trinity, and the list goes on and on. My personal favorite Joe Gibbs joint is Culture's debut album, 2/7's Clash. And the amazing thing about most of Joe Gibbs' releases is how so many of them would blow their way into the global charts, especially Europe, and in particular the UK, by the end of the 70s. And that decade would end with Joe Gibbs' outfit as the most successful studio in Jamaica. However, in 1980, a demo tape by a female singer called JC Lodge found its way into the hands of Errol Thompson, who liked what he heard. In the middle of that year, the Mighty Two invited her to come and record a cover of a country song called Someone Loves You Honey from 2 years before, and upon release, it became a smash in Jamaica that reached number 1 and stayed up there for several weeks. This song would also find its way into the charts in Europe by 1981. It reached number 1 in the Netherlands and stayed up there for 6 weeks, going platinum in record time. Also number 1 in Belgium, plus top 10 in West Germany. But the euphoria of Joe Gibbs' latest in a long line of smash singles and albums would fizzle out and turn to calamity as Charlie Pride, the original writer and singer of that song, would sue him in a humongous lawsuit. Apparently, Gibbs had failed to credit Charlie Pride as the writer of that song and instead put his own name, and in the process claiming all the rights to the royalties. Joe Gibbs was eventually sued by Charlie Pride and giant record label Arista Records. He lost the case, and the penalty was so devastating that it wiped out all the finances which he had built for almost 2 decades, sending him into bankruptcy and forced him to close down his legendary studio in 1983. Gibbs was forced to start afresh and embark on new ventures like a grocery store, which he would run with the same level of ingenuity which he had applied to his music business. But that wasn't the end of his musical adventure, mind you, as he would reunite with Errol Thompson and reopen the studio 10 years later in 1993. But by then, the music had changed, and he found it very difficult to gain traction in what was the blazing hot era and peak of dancehall. But ever the fighter, he would keep on his grind and would enter into a partnership with VP Records in 2002. Unfortunately, his longtime collaborator Errol Thompson died of ill health in 2004. He established Joe Gibbs Records in Europe and was still actively working on getting new talents when he passed away from a fatal heart attack in 2008 at the age of 65. He went down as one of Jamaica's top producers and definitely among the greatest that the reggae genre has ever seen. The scale of his influence in the golden era is unmatched, not to mention his genius level abilities in business that saw his creations crack the global charts like very few before him had done. And though his stunning dominance was brought to a halt by legal troubles, it can't change the fact that on the whole, the great Joe Gibbs was a titan and among the most important figures in the history of reggae music. So there you have it. Thank you for watching this video today. Please leave a like, subscribe, and until next time, Jah bless.